The Jungle Tide by John Still. Dingiri. Hide her in the thorny vine, poison berries overhead. Safe where living tendrils twine, wreaths of scarlet for the dead. Hide her where the vipers creep, patterned by the checkered shade, lidless eyes that never sleep. Watch for her, the gods betrayed. Lead her where the leopard cubs play as kittens lately born. Guide her where the sambar rubs velvet from his hardening horn. Chapter 4. Tanks. In the Great War, when so many things had to be shrouded in mystery, some genius invented the name tanks as a cloak for a new form of mobile artillery. Because, it must be supposed, the name hid instead of revealing. With no reason of war to excuse it, the same thing happens in Ceylon, and the word tank there indicates not iron or cement cisterns, but the finest item of the ancient Sinhalese culture and the most beautiful feature of the country, excepting only the mountain peaks and valleys. I know a place where wooded hills that are the home of many bears thrust their long promontories far into a blue lake. In shallow bays between the woods, families of pelicans cruise slowly, fishing as they go, their white bodies gleaming like a squadron of toy yachts. Waves break upon the shore, and crocodiles lie basking on the ground there, or stretch themselves at length on little grassy mounds left by the receding water, where they lie with their mouths open wide like traps set for use. The trees that overhang the water are nesting places for colonies of egrets, large and small. Herons abound there, and several kinds of storks. And in shallow water the strange spoonbills run with their flat-tipped bills, scooping up food like a boy with a shrimping net. Plovers and sandpipers run along the beach, and stilts with their legs like red sealing wax stand and whistle. And if one has fortune, rose and white flamingos may be seen wading far out from land, sometimes in large flocks. 5 kinds of kingfisher are common birds there, and I have seen another very rare one. White-headed fishing eagles call like clarinets from high trees where they watch for the shoals, and the chestnut-colored kites mew as they hover hungrily along the margin of the lake. Once, when I crossed in a boat and landed on the far side in a prairie of grass growing as high as my shoulders, a herd of wild buffaloes that I estimated to contain about 80 head rose up and stood in a curve of wondering faces, hesitating whether to fight or fly. As the water sinks in the southwest monsoon and the flats become carpeted with soft grass, the deer venture farther from the encircling woods, and herds of wild swine plow up acres of the new pasture in a night in search for food. This is a place to watch peafowl, for at the back of the lake they are bound, and their loud catcalls are the earliest herald of dawn. To reach the village, among the coconut palms below the bund on the deep side of the lake is a long walk, whether one goes by the north or by the south, for the water's edge measures more than 30 miles. 3 sides of it are formed by natural rising ground, but the 4th was built by a king while England was still a Roman colony. From hill to hill he strung a bank more than 3 miles long and 300 feet through at the base, and in it he built 3 great stone sluices, opposite to the deepest of which an ocean-going ship could even now lie at anchor and not touch bottom. This is a tank, one of the largest kind, of whose class only a score or so exist in the island. The effigy of its builder stands on the bund. He has been deified, and a small temple of one room has been built to him. But his more lasting memorial pervades the forest for many miles to north and south, where he has been merged in the wood god who reigns in that region now that the jungle tide has risen over the towns and villages that lived upon the bounty of his tank. The name of the king is known to history, though that of the older wood god seems to be lost, for both are now united in the name of the tank itself, where, as god of the lake, they enter into the folklore and myths of 100 jungle hamlets. The hills above the tank are uninhabited, but they are still full of legends, not quite forgotten by the few people who roam them. Though how long they will resist the age of petrol is uncertain. To realize how such tanks came into being, one must know something of the history of Lanka. The idea underlying the system was simple but very great. It was intended by the tank-building kings that none of the rain which fell in such abundance in the mountains should reach the sea without paying tribute to man on the way. In the middle of the southern half of Ceylon is a wide mountain zone, but to the east and north dry plains cover thousands of square miles and at present are very sparsely populated. In the height of the monsoon, when armies of storm-swept clouds rush on day after day to match their strength against the hills, there is a line drawn by nature that the rains are unable to pass. It is as well defined as the line of trenches that severed Europe in the war, and infinitely more durable in defense. On one side, thunder roars, rain pours down at a higher rate for the month than the rainfall of London for the whole of a very wet year. Torrents grind deep grooves into the faces of the mountains. Rice fields brim over. Tea and rubber thrust their roots deeper into the depleted soil, and dripping forests smell sweetly of growth and the urge of life. But on the other side of the line there is no shelter from the burning sun, except where fugitive wisps of clouds sail so high above the baked plains and are so spent after their battle with the hills, that their thin rain only reaches the earth to rise again in steam, and leaves behind it no more than the sweet scent of moistened clay, for which the Sinhalese alone of all people I know have a special name. Streams dry up and become the roadway of the thirsty animals. Tanks dry up and leave in iron-hard mud their record of the last to drink from them. Leaves fall from the forest trees and litter the ground, making noisy the passage of the smallest beast. Large tracts of forest are deserted and grow silent, save for the rustling passage of the hot wind, and leopards gather on the flanks of the herds that are driven to concentrate near the larger tanks or along the banks of the few live rivers. There are points where the line of demarcation of the two zones, the wet and the dry, is so narrow that within a mile one seems to pass into a new country. For the whole character of the forest alters, and in size and kind and distribution the trees differ completely from those one can still see behind one. The wild flowers take new forms and colors. Different birds sing in the bushes. Cultivation changes abruptly, and wealth ends. The line curves from sea to sea and appears to be stable and unaffected by the operations of men, such as felling forests. It is a curious fact that whereas the bulk of the population and most of the wealth have been found on the wet side of the line during the 4 centuries of European rule, it was exactly the opposite in the days before the power of Lanka declined. To make money, one stays as a rule on the wet side, but to see the ruins of temples or monasteries, of palaces or engineering works, one must go to the dry side of the line. Another fact even more curious, has only recently been made quite plain by the government malariologist, perhaps without knowing it. He published in a report a little map of Ceylon with the prevalence of malarial infection in different districts, shown upon it by varied shadings. The worse the malaria, the bleaker the map. Had I been making a map to show the prevalence of ancient inscriptions, the surest way perhaps to indicate the ancient density of population, my map would have hardly differed at all from his. The theories of policy were widely different then and now. The rulers of old thought in terms of food supply grown by their own people for their own needs. The whole of society was organized on that basis, and the system of land tenure depended upon it. Hill streams were tapped, and their water guided into the giant storage tanks below, some of them 4,000 acres in extent, and from those channels ran onto other large tanks farther from the hills, and from them to others still more remote. And below each great tank and each great channel were hundreds of little tanks, each the nucleus of a village. All, in the long run, fed from the wet mountain zone. So gradually the ancient Sinhalese conquered all or nearly all the plains that are now so empty of men. But for the hills where we grew tea and rubber, they did not care. Few ancient remains are to be found among them, and the forests we found there and destroyed were of immense age and probably of true virgin growth. The tank age endured for more than 15 centuries, and then the jungle tide arose over it and all signs or memory of it became lost. It is now about 1 century since coffee planters attacked the forests of the hills. They have at last begun to conserve the soil, but in the early days of planting they lived upon nature's capital, and the humus laid in store by the leaf fall of millions of years was flayed off by the rainfall of a few thousands of days, when first the soil was denuded of its protecting forests and carried down in spate into the sea. And now the old tree lives on fertilizers. In time, the jungle tide will swing once more, and then those who care for other things than wealth will wander back to the wet side of the monsoon line, and while elephants browse where tea is now plucked, antiquaries will unearth the ancient bungalows of the British period, or even of the Scottish, which will lie beneath it, and classify the different kinds of bottles found among the ruins and arrange them in museums. Having both planted tea and arranged the antiquities of a museum, I venture to prophesy that this picture will be realized in very much less than 15 centuries, perhaps in 1/5 of that, or perhaps in 1/10. This comparison does not necessarily mean that the modern system is a failure, or that the ancient was better. The two ideals and their resultant forms of civilization are so utterly different that no one should draw a comparison between them without special knowledge of both. Village tanks are the centers not only of all human life in their vicinity, but of many other kinds. Cattle and dogs and buffaloes drink from them. The buffaloes with complete indifference, for crocodiles do not often dare even to attack their calves for fear that the whole courageous herd will rush in and trample them to death. The dogs more gingerly and with infinite wariness. From tanks of hundreds of acres down to those that cover only 4 or 5, each is a wonderful harbor of bird life. And even the smallest generally have a water forest of lotus where flowers star the green as daisies star our lawns in England. Or maybe they are the giant red lotus, like immense peonies, whose tangle of blue-green leaves are the home of the talkative jacana, the tank pheasant, who runs on the tops of the floating plants, and of the gallinules who live in deeply colored families like purple poultry. In the forest which covers the ancient kingdom, far from the sounds of men, one comes upon the bunds of tanks now utterly forgotten, where the banks have given way and the beds become like natural glades for deer to graze in. Pigs find mud holes and wallow there, and wild buffaloes spend the heat of the day sunk in their pools with only the tips of their noses showing. And in the trees that ring them round, monkeys love to linger, scattering the rinds of fruit upon the grass. In some parts, where abandonment is not so far back in time, no more than 4 or 5 centuries perhaps, the old fields have become parklands, whose open glades and clumps of trees are beloved of all the greater beasts and of peafowl. The largest herd I ever saw of wild elephants was browsing in one of these park-like glades. There were only 16 of them, and 3 of these were babies, but their bulk seemed to fill the glade, and I walked amid the men of ancient times where man was not yet the dominant species, fated to destroy the beauty of earth. The men who built the tanks knew their business. I remember an engineer telling me how he had to take water from a channel 50 miles in length to supply the fields of the villagers below. After he had made a level survey, he selected 3 spots where he cut into the bank a king had built about 400 years after Christ, and in 2 of the 3 pits he dug, he came upon the ruins of Sinhalese sluices. So they must have made their level surveys too, and plotted them to a yard with his. Another thing they knew was that a sluice should be slightly wider at the outer than at the intake side. I owned a boat once on a tank whose waters covered about 3 square miles. On one side, a small town had risen from the ashes of a buried city, once the capital of Lanka, and on the other side, forest came down to the water's edge, and wild elephants used to wade in and bathe. There is a railway now on the city side, and a hotel, and motor omnibuses ply. But when first I knew the place, it was as wild as a man could wish, and the haunt of thousands of water birds. When the whistling teal rose for their evening flight, the clouds of their flocks filled the air with their voices as they streamed across the afterglow in endless strings. 2 ladies came from England to see the ruined city before trains had made it easy, and I took them out in my boat. "Are we likely to see a crocodile?" they inquired, and when I said 100, they smiled compassionately. But before we stopped counting, we had reached 200. Not in one place, of course, but during the hours of the afternoon. In a shallow bay of that tank there stood a grove of dead trees whose roots had been drowned when the tank was restored 20 years before, and now their bark had all peeled off, and they were bleached white by the sun. One does not see trees like that in the forest, for their wood is devoured by termites before they have been very long dead. Scores of black divers used to stay for an hour at a time with wings outstretched like coats of arms, while they sat on the branches of the dead trees and dried themselves, and egrets nested there and dropped their precious white plumes into the water, where young crocodiles waited for the young birds to learn to fly. Not far away there was another tank, for the ancient city was a sort of inland Venice amid encircling tanks, and I used to go there evening after evening to shoot a teal for my larder. This was smaller, and one could sit on the bank and watch the crocodiles fishing only a stone's throw away. Sometimes a savage pair of jaws would be thrust out of the water almost vertically, and one saw them champ as they worked a big fish into position. But more often the hunters were hidden, and all one saw was the souls of frightened fish that rushed out as the hungry snouts ploughed the mud. The big ones leaping high out of the water, and the little ones shooting out in silver spray like jets from the rows of a gardener's cairn. In the trees at the back of a colony of weaver birds had built their city overhanging the water. Dozens of their queer nests, like inverted stockings, hung out to dry, were built together, visible a quarter of a mile away, and yet they survived and built in the same place year after year, for the nests were mazes the birds of prey could not find their way into, and were too tough to be torn open. Crocodiles guarded the bases of the trees from wild cats, and their only enemies in a land where boys do not collect eggs were tree snakes, to whom they probably paid tribute of their young so that the race might survive. I was charged by a wild buffalo there once and had to climb a euphorbia, a tree like a monkey puzzle. For the wild came to the very doors of that small town on the buried city, and I once missed a leopard on the spot where an official's bungalow stands now and a monastery was built 2,000 years before. It had killed a bull, and I sat in a tree above the kill with a lantern hung from a bough, for the night was wet and dark. But the leopard paid no regard to the lamp, so perhaps the idea that a campfire keeps wild beasts away may be groundless. One day, near the end of the dry weather, I went to my favorite place to spend an hour watching the crocodiles, but not one appeared. And when I went to explore, I found the mud scored with tracks running parallel, as though all the crocodiles in the tank had joined in migrating to deeper water. There were, I reckoned, the tracks of about 30 of them, and I never saw another in that tank until the rainy season had set in. I fancy migrations such as this are of frequent occurrence, as the smaller tanks shrink and dry, until from beautiful lakes they are reduced to wide ponds, from ponds to narrow moats along the contour of the bund, and so to a chain of pools. The crocodiles are crowded closer and closer together until at last they can bear each other's company no more. I sat by a village tank once that had reached the stage of being a moat, about 400 yards long. All the tanks in the neighborhood had dried up completely, and their crocodiles were concentrated in this narrow creek where they waited for the rains to come. Some lay out on the mud with mouths agape. Others had wriggled halfway up the bund, where they lay at all angles like stranded logs. A few had climbed onto the trunk and branches of a fallen tree, and the rest floated on the surface of the pond. I counted 127 visible at one and the same time, and probably there were more hidden. It seemed a lot for the villagers to bear that 6 crocodiles should live, love, and die in their only drinking water. But they took no steps to get rid of them, partly because gunpowder was expensive, but more owing to the apathy of people who have never known in all their lives what it is to be free from malaria. It was not from reluctance to kill, for there were keen hunters among them, and they did some contraband trade in meat. When great personages visit the jungle, they always shoot crocodiles. It is easy, and the cable looks well. Man-eating crocodile killed. Are there such things, I wonder, as crocodiles who would not eat man if they could get him? A fat child, for example? I doubt it, and think man-eating crocodile, like apple-eating boy, denotes opportunity and not a degree of turpitude. I once killed 9 in a morning, and even now that my feelings have drawn nearer to Buddha's, I cannot feel very penitent, though I would not repeat it, for it is not a high form of sport. Only twice have I killed crocodiles in a way at all sporting, for sport must contain an element of risk, even if it is only the risk of being found out. In one case the risk was mine, and in the other it fell to a Mohammedan coolie, and he shall have preference. It was drawing towards evening, and I sat by the ruins of a shrine on the high bund of a tank with a shotgun in my hand, hoping that green pigeons would fly over me, for in those days of happy poverty I relied on my gun to feed myself. In my pocket, as always, lay 2 ball cartridges, for one never knew what might come along, and it was a fixed rule to carry them. In the tank below me some men were bathing, and one had swum out beyond the rest, but suddenly he turned with a cry, and raced with splashing over arm strokes to the foot of the bund where I sat. "Crocodile!" yelled his friends, and I saw a crocodile swimming on the surface apparently in pursuit of the splashing man. By the time I had loaded with the ball, it was almost up to his legs, so I stood up to get the additional height to enable me to fire over and knock into the man's back. It was a lucky shot, but a shot has to be lucky for someone. I fired over the man and hit the crocodile in the head, whereupon it sank and was no more seen. The man was out of breath, but he had a great adventure to tell for the rest of his life, and I a small one. The other adventure was my very own, shared only by the crocodile. Once more, I was looking for green pigeons, this time in the bed of a breached and abandoned tank where trees had grown in scattered groups like an old orchard. They were wild pahunyas for the most part, whose wood is used by the Vedas for making fire by stick friction. But along the line of the bund towered a row of huge giants of another species whose roots love water. 2 small boys hung by my heels to carry my game and share the sport. Their home tank had dried up, and now the whole population of their village, a score of souls, had lived for several weeks beside a pool in the bed of this old tank, where they waited for the rains to render their hamlet habitable once more. Soon another boy joined us, and to me he said, "Would you like to shoot a crocodile?" "Yes," said I, and he led me to look for it. It took me to the bund where the orchard of wild fruit ended, and the great tree stood as a rampart on the edge of the forest, and to one of these giants he pointed and said, "It's in that cave." The tree leaned, for a gale had blown it at some time against the trees behind. It could not fall, for they propped it up, but its roots had torn up the top of the bank on which it grew in a pad, and beneath them was a cave, as the boy not unjustly called the wide low crack that had opened in the earth. I think it was about 20 feet long, and I know it was not high enough for a man to crawl into on hands and knees, but it was high enough for a short-legged crocodile to do so, and it seemed to go a long way in. I was young, though not so young as that boy. Perhaps I was more foolish. Anyhow, I fulfilled my contract to hunt a crocodile, and went in lying flat on my stomach and pushing with my toes. It smelt more than earthy, and was very dark, but soon a gleam of light was reflected by the eye of the poor beast who had hidden there to await the rains that were to release him and make all happy once more in his tank, as in the homes of the marooned villagers. It proved easy to kill him. Indeed, I could not miss, for I could have poked him with the gun. So it was fortunate that he died without lashing out even once. For crocodiles are marvelously retentive of life, and the most ghastly sight I ever saw was a crocodile a man had shot, dead as he thought, and half-skinned, starting off with flapping hide to try to reach water. This one died with no struggle, and I hastened out again, dusty, half-deafened, thirsty, and for some obscure reason shaken with laughter. But now I had as good a story as the Mohammedan coolie. Beside tanks, one sometimes finds stones with cobras carved upon them. The body of the snake is treated conventionally, arranged in plump curls, and there are generally 3, 5, or 7 heads with their hoods raised. Cobras with many heads are common motifs in Sinhalese sculpture and are called nagas, a word that means cobra in many of India's languages. But in the beginning of Sinhalese literature, people called Nagas find frequent mention and had lent their name to a part of Lanka at least as early as the time of Ptolemy, for he gives them a place on his map. This is but one of the frequent glimpses we get in the jungle of tribes that were old when the Sinhalese were new. For, like the submerged religions still known and practiced by the jungle folk, who call themselves Buddhist, there are submerged traces of pre-Buddhist culture of many kinds that should be collected before it is too late. Some word must be said on the strategical aspect of tanks, for it almost certainly influenced Sinhalese history profoundly. A city encircled by tanks could not easily be invested, for the perimeter to be covered by the investing force would become too extended and supplies would get through. But this is not the point I wish to discuss. The ingredients of instability were these, if such a word may be used of a civilization which endured so long. The kings were polygamous and married the daughters of rajas of neighboring kingdoms in South India. It often happened, therefore, that a king had many sons, all of whom might be ambitious. All land was held on service tenure, and in that feudal system the overlord could call upon his tenants to follow him in war. Ambitious princes therefore could command a following irrespective of the justice of their cause or of its chance of success. There was thus every temptation to wage civil war, and it might be said without injustice that civil war was the rule rather than the exception after the termination of any long and successful reign. When a prince was defeated, he fled to India, where he had relatives, and there either awaited another chance of recovering his lost position or raised an army of mercenaries, whom he bribed with promises of loot, and invaded the kingdom he aspired to govern. This is where the importance of the tank system comes to be linked with the history of Lanka's decline and fall. Possibly the Sinhalese may have respected the channels so long as their wars were strictly among themselves, but when Indian mercenaries came in, led by some Cholan or Pandyan chief who had heard of the wealth of the temples and monasteries of a creed alien to him, naturally they cared but to injure their opponents as quickly, as thoroughly as they could. The records are written by monks who knew little of the tactics of war and did not describe them. But they did not spare their bitter complaints of the looting and destruction of the monasteries, and from the enormous repairs found necessary after each period of civil war, and recorded in the list of each great reforming king's deeds as second, in the eyes of the monk historians, to his pious gifts to monasteries, we can tell that tanks and channels suffered terrible damage in war. Their buns must have been cut as an ordinary tactic or as reprisal, frequently and with disastrous results. Anuradhapura, the old capital, derived its water supply from the enormous tank Kalaweva, distant by channel more than 50 miles from the town. Into one large tank that spread for more than 600 acres against the western quarter of the town, the water from Kalaweva first ran, then from that to another smaller tank, but yet nearly a mile across in the middle of the city, right among the monasteries and temples, and from that again to smaller tanks and ponds and pools for bathing, for washing clothes, for drinking, or for growing lotus blooms. The very life of the city was bound up with the supply of water brought from so far away, so what could be easier and more effective than to cut the channel somewhere along its serpentine course of 350 miles? Modern soldiers would not hesitate to do so, and we have no reason to suppose that those of ancient times were more merciful or less sagacious. In the result, fields would be thrown out of cultivation and standing crops ruined. Clean running water, not only throughout the city but over wide areas, would dry rapidly under the tropical sun into a string of pools. Millions of small fishes would be left to perish of drought, and millions more would be captured by birds, where they still fought for life in water all too shallow for them. and mosquitoes would multiply at an appalling rate. The best way to combat malaria is to drain pools where the larvae of the Anopheles mosquitoes can live. And the second best way, where for some reason the pools cannot be drained or filled in, is to introduce small fish who multiply quickly, feed upon the larvae and control them, preventing their increase. War among the tanks reversed both these beneficial measures rapidly and completely, and we cannot doubt that war was almost certainly followed by an epidemic of malaria. That is why the Sinhalese eventually became too enfeebled to keep up the mighty works their ancestors had built. For doctors can measure, almost with precision, the percentage of energy that is lost by malarial infection. It explains too why the map made by the malariologist should so closely follow the map that might be made of the known inscriptions and ruined sites. It explains why the jungle tide has risen and submerged that ancient kingdom so completely. Malaria is so universal in the jungle villages of the old kingdom that I never knew a person who lived there and not had it, not even a child. A friend of mine who once accompanied me to the country I have tried to describe was a doctor, and he examined every child in each hamlet we came to. I talked to the kiddies and fed them with biscuits while he felt their distended little tummies, and among them all found not a single child who had not an enlarged spleen, the sure sign of chronic malaria. So the kingdom went back to the woods, and one may wander for years among ruins and find no end to them. Must one be ranked as opposed to civilization if one prefers the dry and thinly populated side of the monsoon's frontier to the prosperous and wet one? That is a question I find it impossible to answer without first settling what the word civilization means.